All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to ILX's webinar on identifying and managing resistance to change. My name is Sally Moore, and I'm Head of Sales for the ILX Group. In a minute, I'm going to be handing you over to Andy West. Andy's our lead project and change management skills trainer. But before I hand you over, I've got a couple of housekeeping notes. Firstly, we'll be running a Q&A session at the end, so any questions you post will be answered then, and we'll do our very best to answer them all. Secondly, we'll be following up with an email on Monday with all the necessary links so you can access a YouTube video and the slides that Andy's going to talk you through. So do watch out for it. And please do follow us on social media where you can find further helpful resources. And finally, when you sign out of the webinar, a pop-up screen will appear with a 3-question feedback form. We'd really appreciate your feedback on this webinar so that we can keep on improving them in the future. I'm going to be chatting to you again briefly towards the end, but for now, I'm going to hand you over to Andy.
Hello, everyone. As you can see, I'm a project and change management trainer. I've been involved in these sorts of things for probably too long that I want to remember. My background is management development, but therefore, as a trainer, you're always kind of sucked into these sorts of things. Purpose of this webinar, as publicised, to look at change, to consider how change is achieved and sometimes why it isn't, particularly resistance. Why do people resist change? And how might we identify that resistance? And of course, more importantly, how we might do something about it at the end. What I'm going to look at is just to consider what we mean by change, the mechanics we have of change, and have a look at how people react to change, because from their reactions, we can start to identify where that resistance comes from, what sort of things people say about change in terms of some of the clues to their resistance, and therefore some of the kind of symptoms, things that are kind of actions and behaviours that people are exhibiting. From there, we'll start to consider what we might do about that resistance as we go through, and consider some things about momentum and keeping things going. So, first off, it's a kind of simple introduction. What do I mean by change? Well, as the definition there is to alter something, to make something different from what it was before. Interestingly, when we look at business, there's an interesting discussion that says, are we dealing with change or are we dealing with transformation? And sometimes the term change is this is a simple thing, it's a little thing, it's a new computer system, or it's, we're reorganizing the office. We may be changing a location. Transformation is often considered to be that broader strategic change of we're changing culture. We're changing how the organization operates. We're trying to change the structure, the management style, the responsibilities of all those sorts of roles. And I think in lots of ways that's kind of semantics. We still change. It's perhaps the scale of the change we're talking about. So today I'm just going to use the term change as kind of a generic thing. Important point here, of course, is that we use projects. And the classic thing is that projects deliver change. And they're seen as the most effective way of delivering change. I think a better description here is that projects enable change. Projects deliver a capability, a thing, a process, tool, piece of software, new office block, something along those sorts of lines. And the focus of projects is usually on that delivery, on have I delivered the right thing, time, cost, and quality. Change happens when that capability is actually used, when target audience see that item and go, actually, that's what I wanted, and I'm going to go and use it. And so really what we're talking about here is transition. So if change is about delivering something, what we really get here is the kind of transition process of how do I get people going from where they were in terms of working an old way to working a new way, to thinking and behaving in different ways. And it's that kind of transition that's important to us in terms of change. It's about getting buy-in. It's about getting that kind of agreement with what's going on. So as a kind of simplistic way of thinking about this, change happens when we deliver the right capability, when the people we're aiming at have the ability to use that thing and the willingness to use that thing as well. And if you therefore look at change, the output is kind of 1/3 of this, because that's about the right capability. But 2/3 of this are about our stakeholders, their ability to use it. Now, the ability thing may come into training, education, depending on what it might be. If it's a new website, have we built something that actually says, it works so much better that I want to use those sorts of things. I can actually use it. Just making sure that my microphone is working. Apparently it's been a little quiet. So it is important that we have that kind of the right capability. In terms of ability, have I done the training, have I done the education, as I said. But the important thing here to make it work is that willingness, is have I got buy-in from all of my stakeholders? Are they willing to change? And this is often where the theme of resistance comes in. We're delivering things either they don't want, or they don't believe are right, or don't do the job as well as things they've already got. So this is where I'm going to focus, if you like, the threads of my discussion today. First thing, and you may have seen this before on some of our earlier webinars, the Kubler-Ross curve was originally designed to look at people's reactions to things like death or to terminal illness and those sorts of things. It's been adopted within the change community as a description of how people react and the stages of reaction to change. The important thing here is that everybody goes through this curve, even if it's a positive change rather than just for negative changes. It is a function of time, essentially. Some people go through the curve quickly, others will go through it and will get stuck in place and oscillate backwards and forwards. But the general reactions are the same, and therefore some of the resistance may come back to some of the things we see on this particular curve. So, for example, when we start, there's always an element of shock. There's always a shock of precisely what is this change about? What is it we're changing this time round? And why are we changing it this time round? Of course, we can make this worse by not preparing people. If there's an undercurrent thread of this organization does lots of change, this organization is in a state of flux, it may be the shock is due to exactly what we're changing at this particular point, but it may be lessened. If there's been no mention of change, if there's been no mention of the fact that there are some drivers of change or a need for change in the marketplace, this shock can be much worse. Of course, if the change is hidden behind something else, then the shock can be much, much greater. So we can make this worse by not thinking about it. The second step here is denial. And if you notice the curve, there's a kind of upswing in terms of energy and morale and performance. And it's almost a, if we do better, this change won't happen. And it's staff, it's people kind of going, let's work better. If we work harder, then the reasons for change will go away and the change won't happen. And this, of course, is an element of resistance. Yeah, I'm putting the blinkers up, putting the shutters down. It's not going to happen. Third step here, anger and blame. It's all somebody else's fault. It's the people that have done this. It's why is this happening to us now? Of course, in an organisation, this is actually quite visible. This is the visible anger and the unfairness of it all. And it's those sorts of complaints that we can often pick up and deal with. But it gives us a kind of visible symptom of the resistance and the unhappiness about this particular change. If it's a positive one, the anger may be, why now? I've got so many other things going on. But it's probably short term of, I'll get on and deal with it. When Kubler-Ross put this curve together, this fourth step was sometimes called bargaining with God. It's particularly that if I do this, then this won't happen. If I make this bargain with God about changing my lifestyle, then the illness or whatever else will go away, kind of thing. Within change, this is often more related to self-blame, and it's a kind of internalization of, rather, it's not them that's doing it to us, it's because I failed. And actually, this is quite destructive because it's less noticeable. What you're actually starting to get is kind of almost a withdrawal from the changed environment, withdrawal from contact. And again, this could be one of the classic things to look for when I look at the symptoms a bit later on. What that does do is start to erode people's confidence. It starts to erode their belief in themselves, which is why they move into depression and confusion. And the point about depression and confusion is they can't see a way forward. They can't see where we're supposed to be going or the logic of what's going on. And of course, this kind of confusion is kind of, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do next. I don't know where to go. And often I can't even see a light at the tunnel. I can't see a way of taking this forward. The kind of dangerous piece here is that the depression and confusion then triggers back into self-blame. It's more about being my fault, and there's a kind of oscillation here, and this is quite a dangerous place for people to get stuck. What we're hoping for is that people then kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. People being able to see, actually, this isn't about what I've done. This is about the drivers for change. This is about some other external for circumstances or a need to adapt to what's going on. And acceptance doesn't necessarily mean they're happy, but they see that there is a way out of this. And what we're looking for at the top here is problem solving, which is active decision making about where I go next. Now, in some circumstances, that could be people saying, I'd rather not be here. But it's a much better decision to make that they're in problem solving because their morale and performance is actually on the up. And I'm making a positive choice about my life. People who leave organizations where they're in depression and confusion leave feeling that they've had to leave because it was their fault it's gone wrong, and their confidence, their morale is at kind of low ebb, which means when they do join a new organization, they tend to do so in that state, which almost comes to a kind of self-perpetuating myth of it was my fault, I can't do this very well, I'm not going to look for a job. If you look at Peter Senge, this is actually what's called a vicious circle, and therefore people tend to look for smaller things, for things that can't go wrong, and it does go wrong, it's more my fault, and this kind of downward spiral is quite self-destructive. And Peter Senge, when he was looking at the kind of fifth discipline of looking at those, looked at managers being able to get involved and help people out of those kind of downward spirals. So if we look at that curve, 1 through to 5, if you like, step 6, will give us some kind of clues of what's going into this. This is very much an individual reaction. And if you're a line manager, if you're dealing with a team of people that are going through change, these are often the sort of individual things you might want to look for. Stepping back and looking at people as a group, looking at as an organization, looking at a director or a division of organization, sometimes you need to be able to categorize where people are, what sort of reactions are we going to get? Are we getting kind of the right appropriate kind of moves of people going forward? This next model is actually a model I bumped into a previous organization. We had a gentleman called Sunny Pasuli who was actually the head of learning at the organization, and he developed this model so we could start to look at how people in groups react, where do we think our community is, and how might we affect that. So if you look at the left-hand side, the understanding of the change is their ability to understand what's going on. Have we explained it well? Essentially, this is often a function of the effective stakeholder engagement, the communication process. Are we using the right words, and so on. If they have a high understanding, they understand the needs, the drivers, the purpose, the timescales. Low understanding, then we don't understand the needs, the drivers, the purpose, the timescales, how it affects me particularly. So there's a mismatch in terms of understanding what's going on. At the bottom, the capacity to change, the capacity for change within an individual, within a group. Now, this is often a function of experience, a function of sometimes success. A low capacity for change is often people who have worked in organizations where there's been little history of change, where change has been done on an infrequent basis. There hasn't been huge presses for change. In the UK, often if you look at things like some of the utilities before they're privatized, you would suggest that they probably have a lower capacity for change because they have a lower experience of those sorts of things. In some more commercial organizations, the capacity for change is much higher because of the need to remain competitive in a marketplace to see what's going on. And so by looking at this, we get kind of 4 simple groupings where we start to combine these 4 elements. So if we look at the positive stop in the top right-hand corner, first of all, we have a high capacity for change and a high understanding of change. And Sunny called these the learners. These people, change is interesting, it's challenging. They're going to get something out of it. They're going to look at it as an experience where they can actually gain some more skills, more experience, perhaps some leadership things. And therefore, these are often the people who lead change. And we expect less resistance. If we looked at the Kubler-Ross curve, these people are probably going to go through the curve relatively quickly. If you stay on the high capacity for change side, at the bottom, we have a group called the survivors. They can deal with lots of change. They've been around change. They've seen all lots of these things come past. but their understanding is rather poor. So they may not understand the critical nature, the driving forces, why it's so important. And often the reaction here from survivors is when you say, can you do this? Their answer is yes. And they're not actually listening to what you're asking them to do necessarily. They're not taking on board the importance or the critical nature of what needs to change and why it needs to change. Almost they're saying yes to get rid of you. Go away, leave me alone, I know what's going on. And the problem here, of course, is because they haven't bought into the change, is that when we launch the change, they will start doing the new sorts of change things, but they're not particularly committed. They don't really see why it's important that we do this. And therefore, this often triggers what's called homeostasis, which is the natural ability of things to return to what they were. And what happens with the survivors is they go, well, I don't really like that new bit, so let's not do that. Let's just do how we did that bit in the old way. And then we'll take the next bit down and do that in the old way as well. And what happens is they slowly undo the change. And so with a large survivor group, often what you find you end up doing is you have to repeat the change because you launch the thing, you launch the capacity, everybody says yes, you start the transition process, and after 6 months or so, you find that none of that change is actually embedded, and they've gone back to the way things are working. And so we have a kind of critical problem here of misunderstanding. If I look to the low capacity of change, at the top we have a high understanding, and this is called the strugglers. They can change, but they struggle to change. They understand the nature of change, but they don't like very much of it. And so often the sort of thing we have here is the pace of change. There's too much change going on. I can't see what's going on. I want some breathing space. And these are the kind of classic phrases that allow us to understand who those strugglers are. And what they really want is, can we do small changes and do them infrequently? Launch a change, let me try something, and then I can actually, pick that up, work that, and then do something else later. So they tend to want a much slower kind of momentum. The last group, and this is often the most challenging group, have a low capacity of change, and B, don't necessarily understand what's going on. And Sully actually called these the overwhelmed. For this group of people, change is seen as something that's being imposed on them rather than something they feel part of. They feel they don't actually know what's going on. So one, there is clearly an issue with the stakeholder engagement communication process. And two, we haven't understood where they are. And therefore they often feel like they're being pushed into corners. The resistance from these people can be quite strong. It can be quite reactionary. When we look at the symptoms a bit later on, some of the phrases will start to identify those. But this does help kind of sometimes group people. Therefore, we can start to think about different things we might do for those different sorts of groups. Finally, then, just to put kind of change into some kind of context, I look at what's called the Beckhard and Harris change formula. Now, I quite like this because it gets people to think about some of the key things about change. And the purpose of this formula is to go that change will be successful if the multiplication, the sum of A, B, and D is greater than X. X being the perceived cost of the change. How much are we actually going to spend on it? What happens in terms of performance? What happens to people, their morale, maybe their job prospects, maybe their job security? So the perceived cost can cover a whole range of what do we think we're spending on doing this? What's the cost of doing this particular change? The factors we have to consider, the level of dissatisfaction. If we have a high level of dissatisfaction with how the current systems, processes, tools work, then it's much easier to move because people don't want what they've got. If in your organization you are getting lots of complaints about the IT or the process or the building that you're working in, that's a kind of really good ground for doing something different, for changing that, because there is a swell of opinion that we want to do something different. If there isn't that kind of underground kind of complaint process going on, then it's much more difficult to get people to move. If there's absolutely none, people are happy, then we're going to have a problem because they're happy where they are, and how am I going to move them into somewhere else? And that kind of level of inertia is much greater. The desirability proposed end state change. Does this look good to me? Now, there's an important thing here is that one of the major mistakes we often make when communicating change is we talk about the benefits. The benefits to the organization, the benefits to the department, the benefits to this particular division. And we may have, as a member of staff, as a stakeholder change, some interest at a kind of vague altruistic level of, yes, that's good for the business. But in the end, what really makes us interesting, what really gets involved is, what's in it for me? And so the desirability of proposed change isn't necessarily, this is really good for business. This is about what's good for me. This is actually a really interesting one, particularly if you work in a more public kind of government, health service kind of environment, because one of the classic things I've seen is councils publicising changes of this is going to save money, this is going to make us more efficient. The staff are going, oh, great. The residents are going, fantastic. Do I get a refund? The simple answer is no. And so for the residents, the fact that the council is saving money or being more efficient doesn't mean anything unless services are being maintained or being improved at the same time. What's in it for me? Why should I play along with this change in how you're doing things if I've got to do something to make it work when there's nothing in it for me? And it's about sometimes understanding those sorts of things. So when John Cotter talks about, generating some quick wins, often what we should be looking for is quick wins for our stakeholders, things that get our stakeholders to say, actually, this is fantastic. And if we can do that, then we're away. We can actually make sure that we've got the right kind of things working as we go through. So it's trying to ensure that that our stakeholders think that yes, it's perfect. That's actually what I'm after. D is an interesting one. D again is about stakeholder engagement. D is about ensuring that we've taken people's points of view into how we're doing it, not just what we're going to do. The thing here is, it's not about what you're delivering, it's sometimes about how you're delivering it. Have you picked up the right kind of things? Next steps, risk, it talks about disruption, there's all sorts of elements. And of course, stakeholders have a view of, yes, I see what you're delivering is good, but you're doing it in the wrong way. You're not taking account of the things I know about how this is going to work or not going to work. And again, it's about, have I talked to people about the best way of doing this rather than actually what I'm delivering? If any of these elements, A, B, or D, essentially counts as a 0, the change is not going to work because the cost will outweigh the multiplication of A, B, and D. So it's important we've understood those sorts of things. And of course, that actually then feeds into the areas of resistance. One of the key writers that are referred to in the Effective Change Management Handbook is Kanter, who in 2012 was looking at the common causes of resistance. So what I've done over the next couple of slides is take his 10 causes of resistance and link back to things like the Beckhard and Harris change formula, back to Sully Pasuli's 4 groupings of staff, of stakeholders, back to the Kubler-Ross curve about where we think these sorts of things are going. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's just to highlight a couple of those sorts of things as we go through. So, if I look at the first one, loss of control over territory. As a manager, I run this particular department. I run this number of people. I run this number of processes I'm in control of. After the change, I may have less, and therefore the perceived cost of the change is loss of my control, loss of my authority, loss of my profile. And of course, for a manager, this might be, am I being demoted? And that starts to come back into those sorts of things. And it may be, I'm quite happy with how big my team is, how it's working. The excessive uncertainty is very much about the capacity for change, Sully Pasuli's model. Particularly if I'm as a struggler or as an overwhelmed, if I think things are going too fast, if there's too much going on, then I start to feel uncertain about what's going on. Similarly, that comes into too many differences at once. If I feel that I can't cope with those sort of things, I'm going to complain and resist and dig my heels into that particular point. Again, if I look at the loss of face, it's similar to the loss of control, but it's rather than about losing money, it's about the perception of other people. Do I feel that I'm being demoted? Do they feel I'm being demoted? Of course, that might link into things about self-blame and therefore confusion and depression from the Kubler-Ross model, so that you can take some further elements of these as we go through. Concerns about competence very much is into the self-blame and the desirability of the change. Do I think I'm going to be able to do this? One of the classic things we talk about in change here is what's called learning anxiety, which is a kind of resisting force to change. And learning anxiety is I'm told to change. I can't do this sort of thing. I've never done that kind of thing before. And those concerns about competence often stop people trying to learn because it's that kind of fear of failure. If I do this and I can't do it, I will look at failure. I won't look good in the eyes of my colleagues and those sorts of things. The next one, the change small work, I think is an interesting challenge at the moment. It picks into things like capacity for change, both in individuals, do I have some time to go and do this, and as organisations. One of the things we often hear, and we have been hearing for the last few years, is about organisations becoming more efficient, remove any excess fat off the bone, so that we're lean organisations. And often the focus on here is we've got enough people with enough skill, enough resources to do what we need to do for business as usual. And if we pare our organisation down to the bone so that we can do the business as usual as efficiently as possible, that actually gives us no capacity for change at all. Because change is extra work. It's always extra work. If I want a manager to do a change, to work on some kind of change initiative, I have to create some space, some time, which probably means they need to delegate some of their work to someone in their team. If their team are all busy, then they have to stop doing things. And so there's this kind of ripple effect. If I delegate work down, they delegate work down, delegate work down, and suddenly at the bottom, there's some work not being done. And at that point, change is stopping the business as usual. And if we're doing too much change, or if we have no spare capacity, then something is not being done, which might affect our stakeholders, our customers, in the long run. And the problem here is, if it affects our customers negatively, significantly, then when we come back after the change, they've already left. They've voted with their feet. And so one of the things to think about here is, do we have some capacity for change? Have we actually allowed managers some time that says, we're going to get you to think about change at all points. Therefore, some of your working month, your working quarter, your working year, your working week is to focus on change. If we have that capacity, then we can do it. If not, then we can't. And that's where the practicality of the change comes in. You've given me this extra work, but I have no time to do this. Interestingly, I was dealing with a council yesterday, running a course in the council, and this is a really important discussion because there is huge pressure on these organisations every year to be 10% more efficient. And the problem here is that we lose that capacity to be able to do extra things. And unless we kind of go, change is part of our business, we don't allow time. And one of the concerns here, of course, is they're putting undue pressure on people who have business as usual jobs and to change, and something's got to give. And if they try and do both, it's often the people. And that's where we start to see capacity and practicality problems. We start to see increase in stress. Just pick up the last couple of ones. Ripple effects, if I change this, it changes other areas of the business. Practicality, have I really thought through these sorts of things? One of the things here is, have I really analysed this change and really understood all the dependencies? So things like the McKinsey 7S model, where you can start to look at, if I change this, what else does it change? And allows you to understand the true scope of the change, rather than I'm just changing a system. Fantastic quote from an IT person yesterday of, yes, I'm changing the system, but actually that means I've got to change the process, or rather, they've got to change the process. And we need to change the culture because the process and the system now are a different way of working. It's a different level of responsibilities. We probably need a different style of management. And we probably need to make sure that we have people in different places to do this, because it's now much more mobile than being stuck in office because of the mobile IT solutions we're talking about. And so when you start to consider that, the scope of change is quite important, and that ripple effect makes things often far bigger than we thought they were in the first place. Past resentments, we thought we resolved this. Now the change is actually bringing those sorts of things back in the road. So again, it comes under desirability. This is actually bringing up some past kind of anger or blame, and it triggers again. And the last one is sometimes the threat is real. Sometimes our change is going to have a negative impact on people's jobs, their roles, their abilities to do those sorts of things. And it triggers anger and blame. It makes the change undesirable. The simple thing here is honesty. So Kanter identified these kind of 10 reasons for resistance. What I've tried to do is link them back to the transition process, the how we're feeling as individuals, the kind of thought process says, well, where's this really coming from? What we then have to look for is the sorts of things we might do. And all I really have here is a list of suggestions, the things we might do to actually do this. Before we look at those, the first one, well, what am I looking for? I've kind of mentioned some of these already. So kind of types resistant symptoms. I've kind of divided this into passive and active. So it talks about order unhappiness. Now, in the active ones, that is complaints, that is objections, that's people standing up and saying, this is a terrible idea. But the passive version of that is the sullen silence. In fact, just the silence. When you launch a change, nobody says anything. And what's actually going on is they're internalizing this. What you're not getting is any agreement. What you're not getting is any support, any commitment. What you're actually getting is people thinking, this is terrible, I don't like this. And of course, they may be going, they're annoyed about it, there may be some anger in there, but they don't feel they can say this. This is particularly true sometimes in larger audiences. If you're launching a big change and you've got all of the staff there, it takes a very strong character to stand up and go, I think it's a terrible idea. And therefore, sometimes those change messages at the launch is a one way, we're going to tell you what's going on. It may be much better, therefore, to then actually deal with it on a more local area where people feel more open to actually raise objections and raise those things. So I kind of give two levels of the communication process. The disengagement. The passive one is that we never see them. I suppose the vanish like the mist. So when we're talking about change, they don't seem to be there. The active version of that is if we send them invites to come to some kind of presentation, some kind of meeting, there is a formal reject. We can see that they are moving away from this. And of course, that triggers a response because then we will immediately ask. If we don't get a response again, it's kind of that passive one, we have to be looking for that. Are we actually actively looking for those people who haven't responded? Sabotage one. Again, running a course over the last week or so, we're talking about these sorts of things, and people talk about sabotage almost kind of, in jerky fashion, they're going to sabotage what's going on. Well, actually, sabotage can be done in two ways again. The kind of active way is, I don't like this, I'm going to send you lots of issues, I'm going to send you lots of complaints, I'm going to send you lots of objections to this, which you have to deal with. And my purpose in that is to slow things up. If I give you a real example for an organization where I actually used to work, and I wasn't part of the change team, essentially I was one of the stakeholders in this particular project. It was actually a launch of a very simple finance and procurement system, but it meant that all the managers had to take back some activity that pretty much they had all delegated 5 to 10 years beforehand. And for normal circumstances, this kind of project, it probably received 15, 20 issues every couple of weeks. People were sending in queries and comments. This particular project received between 100 and 150 issues every week for the life of the project. Essentially, everybody was sending in complaints and problems as a way of slowing the whole process up. They're going to go, if we send in enough of these, they won't get a progress because they're spending all their time answering the queries and none of their time actually installing it. And it is that kind of thought process of have I managed to slow the process up. The breaking it, using something and actually showing how it's not going to work, how it's not fit for purpose, essentially, because it doesn't meet the needs of the team or the audience. So the classic one here is, you give a team a new piece of equipment, and they come back and go, look, it doesn't work properly, it's not strong enough, it's not fit for purpose. Now, that may be accidental, or it may be on purpose, but that is the kind of sabotage you might actually see. It often comes back to the fact that people may not have felt engaged when we ask them for requirements for process. The more passive version of this sabotage is if we're trying to get people to learn the new system, to respond to what's going on, is we don't get any of that kind of response. It's kind of like disengagement, but we just don't hear anything. There's like the black hole, the silence at the end of the corridor. And at that point, what we have is a group of people who actually don't do anything. By not engaging, by essentially not returning information on booking, they're making the process fail. I can't use the system because I haven't been trained, or none of my people have been trained, or you didn't take account of what things we need. The fact that I didn't send you the information, send you the requirements, means that it's not fit for purpose, and therefore I don't have to use it. So these can be deliberate actions in terms of, I want to make this not work, and that's often where the active stuff comes in. Or the kind of passive of, I'm keeping my head down and not talking to you, because if I keep my head down, you might go away. And what we need to be doing as change professionals, as change managers, as project managers, is to be looking for these sorts of things. And of course, what we really want is the engagement of all of our people, all layers of management, all staff, our customers. And it is sometimes about gathering that kind of information. There's an interesting kind of thought process here, and it's often my personal reaction to things like TripAdvisor and those kind of feedback systems, is that you often generate far more negative feedback than you do positive. And the reason for that is, if people are feeling okay or happy with it, they often don't feel the need, unless they feel particularly happy with it, to then provide the feedback. However, if they're feeling negative, then they will immediately give feedback because they have a negative opinion. And so you often feel that there is a greater or an easier way of sending it from the bad news. And therefore we get that kind of active resistance of those kind of symptoms. If people just don't come, they don't hear something, then are they really for it? Are they really supportive? And in change, what we probably want to do is actually get that positive reaffirmation that we're doing the right things that people find acceptable. Otherwise, we're kind of unsure of how to change, how it's going to work. So, Kanter's strategies. How am I going to deal with these sorts of things? Some of these will come across as common sense, and a lot of this is because it is about making sure that we've thought about these sorts of things as we go forward. So, if you have people who are involved or will be hugely affected, then have they been involved in the planning? So don't plan in secret. Involve, gather their kind of input. Have they get choices? Can they give you some input, or they maybe change what you deliver? And the involvement activity, of course, is about briefing, buying. They talk about minimizing the number of unrelated differences. As an organization, what is our capacity for change? Do we know how much change we can do and yet keep the business as usual working effectively? Now, in structural terms, this is often called the management of portfolios. The portfolio being the complete set of projects, programs, and change activities, and the amount of business as usual we need to do to maintain our operational effectiveness. Can I tie the things I'm doing into programs so that there is a general link, there's a group of related things going on? People can see what we're trying to do and where everything links in. It must be 10 years ago now, I did quite a lot of work with a council in the north of England who actually said that every year they would have 4 programs. Some of those would last more than 1 year, but any one time they would only have 4 programs of work. And all projects within that organisation should be linked to one of those 4 programs, all of which are about the focus on the services they provide to their external environments. They all had a thread about improving services or improving the area and those sorts of things. So things like IT was kind of supporting layer within those programs rather than programming of our own work. But there was always that limit because more than that would affect the ability to do the business as usual. Where possible, keep things familiar. Be clear on what you're changing and what you're not changing. If you look at William Bridges' theory of transition, he talks about endings, and he talks about being clear on the scope of the change, what's changing, what's not. Giving people that sense of security of what are we retaining, what are we actually going to keep the same. And therefore they have the sense of, that's okay, that's still there. Bridges' endings also talks about celebrating the elements of the past. What people have done in the past has had value. We did it because it was right. It may not be right for the future, but it was right then. And therefore there should be some recognition, some celebration of that, linked to the need that it can't carry on because the world has changed. And so it allows people that kind of sense of pride and achievement in terms of what they've done. Communicate. Have backup systems. Keep the old in parallel where you can. Recognize people for what they're going through. So again, Bridges talks about celebrating people who are actually taking things forward. Consider all your affected parties. Work with them. Have you really identified all of your stakeholders? Have you identified what their needs and concerns are, and therefore are you doing those sorts of things? And the last one I think is kind of always be honest. If it's going to have a negative impact, you have to be honest. You may not know the scale of the impact, but it may be much better to say at the start, yes, there will be some negative consequences, and as soon as we know the scale of those, we can then start to deal with it. So it's to look at those kind of basic strategies. And again, when you get the slides, you'll just see this kind of list. The important thing is to build this into some kind of strategy. So 4 things to consider. What kind of resistance? What kind of feedback? What kind of active or passive do I expect to get? And how much? Am I going to expect a lot? Is it a big change? Is it changing fundamentally what we're going to do? Is this the sort of change they've done before? So the nature of the change will have a huge effect on statement number 1. Statement number 2 is, who are they? How much power do they have? How much resistance can they create? Remember, in organizations, they may not have organizational power. They may not be at the top of the tree. But if they have political power, they can engage with lots of other people. They have a powerful voice in your organization. They may actually cause you lots of disruption, lots of resistance. So again, understanding those stakeholders and who they are is hugely important about seeing where we go and how we go and deal with them. Who are the relevant people? Who are the people who have the relevant data to design the change and get to implement it? Who's on side? This comes back to our kind of stakeholder engagement. Do we know who the sponsors are? Who have we got on side? What's our political grouping? Who's our guiding coalition for this? And of course, if we know that we have resistors who've got lots of power, have I got people with similar or greater power kind of pushing the change forward? It is about how can I make those 2 forces actually meet. It's understanding those as we go through. The 4th one is to consider risk. Risk management is a critical thing in projects, in program management, and in change. And therefore, think about resistance as a risk to the project. If there were great resistance at certain bits of the project, what could they do to what we're doing? If we have resistance at the definition stage, does that mean that what we're creating may not be fit for purpose because people have disengaged? If we've got resistance at the delivery stage, does that mean we're looking for things like sabotage? And therefore, the different symptoms might come through at different points in the process. And if we think in that terms of risk, we can then start to identify when have we got to do those things and how might I deal with them? What am I monitoring? So in health and safety, they always talk about before you have a health and safety incident, there's always near misses, and you monitor the near misses, do something about it. It's the same kind of idea here. What are the symptoms? What are the things that tell us we have resistance? What are we looking for? And what do I put in place, hopefully, to mitigate the difficulties? So think about it in that kind of risk way. And it talks about determining the optimal speed of change to make sure that we can deal with resistance, we can kind of get past some of that inertia. I will look at that again in a bit more detail in a sec towards the last couple of slides. Before I do that, just one of the things to consider here, and it comes back to Palsuli's model about different groups of people. The innovation adoption model that Rogers actually looked for quite some time ago actually looks at the kind of curve. So you'll have innovators, you'll have early adopters, and you will always have laggards. And if you consider Palsuli's model, the overwhelmed will always be in your laggard section because, 1, they don't have a great capacity for change, and 2, they don't understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And if we haven't dealt with them, it's going to be much more difficult to get them on side because they're going to lag behind. Now, they always will lag behind. They may be in the late majority because they prefer slower change. And that's about optimal speed. It may well be that in reality, what we have is an organization that's not had a great deal of change in the past. And trying to push through too much fast change means you actually increase the number of people who have a low understanding of what's going on because they haven't been given time to digest. And therefore, our late majority of laggards becomes a very, very immovable chunk. We have a huge amount of resistance because of misunderstanding and the low capacity to change. Different organisation, we find far more learners, and therefore the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, are kind of they speed those sorts of things through. The point about this sometimes is, as the note says there, am I dealing with somebody whose point of view I understand? If you have innovators trying to sell a change to a laggard, they have a completely different viewpoint about what's good in the organisation. The innovators are always going, we should be doing new things, we should be looking at challenges, moving forward, taking things on, trying new things. The laggard's point of view is, this works. Why do something we think works? Their view of the world is quite different. If the innovators try to talk to the laggards might dismiss them as, you just like the lead, bright, shiny things. You're a group of magpies who are just jumping after the latest things that come through. And it's almost, therefore, dismissive of what's going on. There's the resistance. You're talking about something that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm going to follow what you say. It may be much better that the laggards are dealt with by people from the late majority. The people in the late majority will only change if all their questions have been answered. A lot of those questions are shared by the laggards, therefore they can provide those sorts of answers of, I asked that question as well, and it's been answered. And so one of the things here is, have I got the right group of people communicating with the next group of people to help them through this particular process? And your organisation in general will split up like this. This is what Roger's model actually picks up. We look for those kind of areas. So it does suggest sometimes that when I'm looking at resistance, have I got the right people dealing with those resistors? Have I got the people with a similar state of mind, whose questions have now been answered, and they can give a confident answer to the people who haven't yet moved? Of course, in most organisations, who do we expect to do this? Well, we expect our managers, our supervisors, at all levels across the organisation to be a key part of this managing resistance process. Of course, they could be part of the resistance. Middle managers may have vested interest in their own little empire. Therefore, have we done something? They can see why, have they gone through the curve and they're in problem solving. I can see some benefit of this. Managers and supervisors translate policy into action. They translate that high-level strategy into what's going to happen here. And if they sell it effectively and confidently, then their team are much more likely to buy it in. If the message from the manager is, well, we're doing this change and I don't know why, and I don't particularly agree with it, then the entire team is going to go, it's a terrible thing. Why should we bother? And they probably won't. So actually, do we need to engage our managers, our first-line people first? Is this the best way of doing it? Should we cascade this? So we actually start to get buy-in at these levels when we launch it across the entire organisation. Essentially, we've already started to move our managers into the right kind of area. They're dealing with the right kind of things as we go through. So they've got to maintain performance. There will be tensions they have about implementing change and dealing with the resistance as you go through. So communicate, communicate, communicate. Give them the answers. One of the messages sometimes, give them early information. Give them privileged information that shows they get a greater degree of input than perhaps their staff are. But encourage them to gather from their staff objections, because you can use those as a way of selling the idea if you can answer those objections. And of course, one of the things here is our managers and frontline supervisors may need coaching, mentoring, facilitating skills to help us do this. Are we preparing them by making sure our managers and supervisors have the right kind of skills? I remember the organisation I worked for as a frontline manager. Part of my training to be a manager was coaching and performance counselling, facilitating meetings. These were considered to be core skills of all managers at all levels. As you went up, those skills were looked at again and again to ensure that you can actually deal with a greater group of people, maybe bigger groups of people, more senior people. But it's about having the right skills as you go through. So this isn't just about engaging stakeholders within the change. This can also be about preparing your organisation, building some organisational readiness. Do our managers and frontline supervisors have the skills to actually help us do this effectively? And that's about building long-term resilience for change. Have I got the right skills in place so I can do this? The momentum thing then. It's important that once a change starts, it carries on. There are many examples of projects and changes starting fast, and then the momentum eases for whatever reason, maybe funding, maybe lack of interest, or the results don't come through early enough, and therefore people go, it's not really working. Momentum starts to fall, and it grinds to a halt, not because of what we're doing is wrong, but because they've got the wrong kind of momentum. If you have a project or change that's going to take a long time, having too much momentum at the start builds expectations beyond what you can deliver at that particular point. It may be therefore much better to build slow momentum, to keep things going without getting to that big peak. If you have a swift and sudden change, then you need momentum now and it needs to be done quickly. And therefore you have to look at each change and its circumstances in a different way. So we're talking about communication again. We're talking about engagement again. If we want, excuse me, a high degree of momentum, then we do a lot more engagement. We do it far more regularly. We're getting people in with messages again and again. We want an active change management network to ensure that changes are happening multiple times. As John Kanter says, we want to enable broadband action with lots of things happening at the same time. If we have a longer project, then our broadband action may be a number of things across the organisation, but they're small things. They're things to get things started, looking for success with those sorts of things. So again, it comes back into these kind of strategies of timing, phased approach. What do I tell people when I'm going to do it? Visibility. Do we have everybody communicating the same messages? Is there a level of consistency? Interesting point here is, if the drivers of change, if the vision for the change is not being talked about, people's assumption is the change has gone away and not going to happen. Have I got the right people actually trying to deal with the right things at the right time? Have I got people, managers, line managers, dealing with that transition? Have they got the skills to enable their team to move forward? The way of dealing with resistance is to be aware of it, to not shy away from it. You are going to get it. And the kind of thought that kind of brings this together really is, change isn't easy or comfortable. People are always going to feel uncomfortable about change because they're moving from an area of comfort to an area of discomfort. And therefore there is going to be resistance of all kinds at all levels of the organisation. We need to identify A, our stakeholders, and B, what sort of resistance, what form of resistance. Why have we got it? Is it down to fear? Is it down to lack of education training? Is it a bit of fear about learning? Is it a fear about work, the overloading? How might I then deal with it? Have I got the right mechanism in place to answer those? Essentially, resistance is a form of objections. And one of COVID's 7 habits is seek first to understand and then be understood. And I saw a change manager do this fantastically. He actually got a group of people together and said, I understand you don't want this change to happen. Can you tell me why? And he gathered all their objections. He said, so if I could deal with all of these, there's no reason why the change shouldn't work. And he got their agreement. And then he went through with that group and worked out ways of removing all of those objections, removing all of the resistance. It's one of the most fantastic pieces of facilitation I've ever seen. But actually it turned a group of people who were actively negative into a group of people who are actively supportive of the change. And that's the kind of thought process we're talking about. I hope you found that useful. Sally's going to come back in a second and give you some details of an offer. If you want to think of questions, we'll deal with those after Sally's had a few words. Sally?
Well, thank you so much, Andy. I hope everyone has found the session informative and helpful. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be ending with a Q&A session. But before then, I'd like to highlight our special offer on our APMG International Change Management Programme. So if that is something that you're looking to gain an accreditation in, then you need to look no further. So we've got a 50% off our foundation e-learning program. So if e-learning is your preferred way of learning, then we've got a special offer on that. If you prefer to do your learning in a classroom, we've got 20% off the classroom foundation and practitioner change management program. This offer is only valid till the 30th of September. You can order directly from our website, www.ilexgroup.com. You need to enter the code webinar20 to activate your discount. If anyone has any questions that they prefer to ask me outside this forum, please don't hesitate to contact me on my email address, which is sally.moore@ilxgroup.com. I'd like to thank you all for your time today, but before we say goodbye, I'd like to hand you back over to Andy, who is going to be open for questions, which you can type in the chat section on the right-hand side of your screen. So many thanks. Andy?
Thank you, Sally. So, ladies and gents, any questions, any queries, things that you'd like to raise that we might try and address? The biggest concern so far has been the microphone, just making sure it's actually right by my mouth so people can hear me. I hope on the video it's all good. I'll give you a couple more minutes just to consider what's going on. So one message I would give you, and probably to reiterate what I was just saying as the kind of thought summary, is resistance is a natural part of change, and sometimes it can be your advantage, because if you can deal with the resistance, you can actually build much greater commitment about what's going on. First question is, any tips for getting stakeholders on board? That's probably as how long are those a piece of string. As I said earlier on in the webinar, often stakeholders are looking for what's in it for them. When Kanter looks at his 8 steps for effective change management, he talks about generating quick wins. I would also suggest, as part of a change program and things that are going on, look for things which get stakeholders to go, yes, I want those sorts of things. Involvement, input. Are we engaging them early about the change? Are we raising, if you like, the drivers of change and asking what their views are? The point about Beckhard and Harris one is, if people say there's a problem they want to resolve, they kind of buy themselves in because they actually want it. So it is about how do you pick that kind of thing up as you go through. So they can, how do you involve? I guess involvement is the big one, but that's it. It's how do you do it and who are they as you go through. If people feel they're being listened to, they're much more involved. Next question. I would like to see greater emphasis on the managers. Many of my clients have been witness to bullying in the change cycle. I absolutely agree. One of the early webinars, which you can find on our YouTube channel, looks at middle managers as agents for change within an organization. Managers are often our translation device. They take the strategy from the top of the organization and turn it into what we're going to do in the front of the organization, what we do at the front line, if you like. Our managers need to be part of that particular change process. Now, some of them may be resistant to change because they've built their little empire. It's how can I get them excited and interested? Bullying is kind of a negative way of getting things done. What we want is buy-in, people actually seeing it as a way forward rather than as I'm being pushed into a corner making things being done. And often, if you look at Suli Pasuli's model, the overwhelmed, often, if we don't deal with those in a positive way, they do feel that they've been bullied. So again, it comes back to the previous one of engagement. Why has this got to happen? It's not a personal thing. It is about what's appropriate for the organisation. But if we want the organisation to change, there has to be something in for the stakeholders and the staff. If we want their buy-in, they have to feel it's worthwhile activity. It's picking those sorts of things up. So I think managers are, or should be, all middle managers should be the agents of change. They should be our change agent network. They should be champions. We should be using them because they're the best people to understand what their staff need, want, and how to translate the things going on. And that would get past the thing of bullying because it's engagement, not force. And that way we can actually move it forward. But that's about how we do those sorts of things. It's about the skills of managers. Do our managers have the right skill? Do they have the right kind of style? Have we done something to prepare the organisation for that kind of change? Let's look at the next one. How would you scale this across different size organizations? Really important point. If you have a big organization, then clearly you're going to need far more people to help you with change. and your manager become this. As a smaller organisation, it's the same kind of things. But often, if you're a relatively small organisation, your frontline managers, they're your agent for change. They're often people delivering your change and your projects for you. And lots of ways, it's almost come back to the same one. If we've got the skills of that management layer, are we therefore able to do change effectively? What you don't want to do is build a big infrastructure if you don't actually need it. So I guess that how would I scale this across different organizations? How much change are you expecting? How much change do you think you need to do? Is there some kind of strategic planning process being done at the highest level that says, we expect to do this number of projects and this number of programs this year? And then to look at that, kind of go, well, how much do I need to put into this? All organizations have to change. So in all organizations, there must be some knowledge of how we do change effectively. If you're a big organization, you might need, but not spread across lots of different places. It needs a kind of that level of training. In a small organization, it may be 1 or 2 people because that's enough in terms of what's going on. But I guess the thing to look at here is how much change and how many people and what's their kind of reactions to it. And then you can start to judge by looking at all of those parameters, how many people should be organised in it, how many people should be involved in what's going on. How would you recommend educating a senior management team who voice desire for change but do not have the capacity required, time, dedicated resource, to successfully deliver the change? Now, this is actually one of the classic ones of that we want this change to happen, but you've got you and you've got to do the business as usual job, but we don't want any failures in it. There's always a downside to change. There's always some disruption. They call it the learning dip. Projects and programs, there's benefits. And it's important we understand what those sorts of things are. So it's when we're looking at a change, when we're looking at programs and projects, is to be honest about what is the disruption going to be, what is the downside of this change. But the other one I would do here is risk. The value of those benefits, the deepness of the dip, the length of the dip, is based on certain assumptions. If those assumptions are wrong, that dip could be far worse. And what I would actually start to then do is highlight significant risks which are linked to those assumptions. And those risks will be risks which cannot be resolved at the delivery end. They have to be resolved at the strategic level, which is the senior management level. So essentially, they're going to score very high for probability and very high for impact, or somewhere up there. And therefore, they have to be escalated to senior management because it's a risk question. And if you have a culture of risk management, by having those sorts of risks in there, you A, raise awareness, and B, build input. They are required to manage those sorts of risks. If you have a risk-averse organization by identifying any kind of risk like that, of what would happen if we don't manage this resistance, then actually what starts doing is highlighting and using the channels you have available. So I would suggest that's a good way forward. Rather than being your problem as the person delivering the change, it's their problem as the owners of the change. This may stop the change happening, and therefore they might need for resources, time, extra people. And it may well mean, and one of the things to consider here is backfilling. It may be that what we need as a temporary thing is if we can delegate work down so the manager has time to do some work, they delegate it to somebody in their team and so on, the cascade effect. Are we putting some resources at the bottom who can fill in the gaps at the bottom? And that may be much cheaper than buying somebody at the top as a consultant or whatever else. We do the change ourselves, but we need to spend some money on managing it. And that's almost part of the risk. What would we do? What would happen to us if this work isn't done whilst doing the change? And if that's significant, there may be a willingness to pay for some staff to actually help us with this. But that would be my suggestion. That's the kind of mechanism I've used in the past. Because if you want to take your company in another direction, you might be the only one as high, the only one seeing where you've got to go. So are you the isolated person? Are you an isolated voice? This is not uncommon in change. Change is often triggered by somebody who has an idea. They may or may not have the power to make it work. This is why we talk about sponsors, we talk about steering groups, we talk about guiding coalitions. Can I do something to persuade people, other people at a senior level, that there is a need for change here? Again, there can be a risk. What would happen if we did the what if kind of scenario? Now, the reality here is, if you want to go in a certain direction forward and the rest of the senior management team don't wish to, it may be that there's a negotiation at the start. And if you look at the organization metaphor about politics, one of the things they always say is that if you're building a guiding coalition, there's always a sense of negotiation. It may be you want to take a big step in a different direction. And it may well be that they don't want to take any steps at all. But by negotiation, we might agree some small steps in the right direction. But at least we can start some movement. That may not be the momentum you want, but it may give you a start of momentum. And therefore, a change may be better than no change. So if you feel you're a lone voice, build a political group, build a kind of group of people or push it, which gives you a bigger voice. It may mean you don't get everything you wanted today, but you may get some of what you wanted today, and that may be an important first step. If middle managers are the key to change, do you build capacity before or during their engagement? Quite frankly, I think organizations should be building capacity and capability for change in managers as part of their basic skills. I think all managers need to understand change because there's going to be some in their team, and they should maybe be the sponsor of small change in their team. But I also think they need the appropriate skills to do this. So I think actually it should be a permanent part of. I am a trainer, and therefore I may be a heretic about those sorts of things. I would suggest if we haven't got the capability management, then we need to do it as part of the engagement. So we need to get them interested, we need to get them buy-in, and then we start to give them the skills and capability in order to support it before we start doing any of those sorts of changes. Because then when the changes come in, they already have the skills. If the managers don't have the skills, then we're back into one of Kanter's resistance areas of, I can't do this, I'm too old to learn these new tricks. If we've already given them the new tricks, then they're better position to do it. So if we're building long-term capability, start by training all managers. If we're looking at what we've currently got at the moment, engage capability, then engage with the rest so that the managers are ready to support the rest of the changes as you go forward. That makes it a much healthier kind of operation. Next question then. If there is a persistent resistance to change, what do you do as a change manager? Now that's actually an interesting one. If we have a persistent resistance to change, then clearly something is being missed because it may be taking different forms each time. And one of the things here is, have we found out all the reasons for their resistance in the first place? If the answer is no, every time you fix one problem, they're going to throw another one up. It's like kind of throwing hurdles in front of you if you're trying to run. If you get past the first one, they're going to throw another one in front of you, which you're probably recognizing as the sensation for at the moment. What I would suggest here is, before we start dealing with one hurdle, have we found out, are there any more actually coming our way as well? So the point I made about the facilitation was, are these all of the objections? Are these all the reasons why this can't be done? And if we do that effectively at the start, then we start to remove all of the hurdles rather than doing it. Now, one of the things we're going here, and I guess it's almost down to me, is I just don't want to do this. And I guess the question has to be why, and it's just because I don't want to. That's probably just about capacity for change or the uncertainty, which could be it's a fear of failing, it's those sorts of things. Are they getting support from their manager? Are they getting that kind of line management support from above? So it's kind of those layers of change that are going through. We can't just get middle managers to support the people below them if they're not getting support from the people above. So there are those sorts of things, but it's persistent resistance. It's often down to multiple hurdles, and therefore can I identify all of those and start dealing with ones rather than keep finding new hurdles as we get past them. We are expecting a degree of honesty here, because that's the way it works. And if we look at long-term business relationships, they always get better with honesty. If we're not getting honesty, then we're going to have some difficulties here. And that comes from probably different solutions in an organization of people essentially doing things because they don't want to and actively causing trouble. Now, that may be a different route to resolve that completely. Remember, as managers, we want buy-in, but we do have other things. If people are being deliberately promised, creating issues, those sorts of things. Probably not the audience for this at the moment, but that's my first thoughts. Next question. What's the best approach to effect when you are an external vendor? Now, this is an interesting one. If you've been asked to deliver something which effectively is going to affect change, the classic one is if you're an external IT organization, you've been asked to deliver something to an organization. What you're doing is building the capability. And you're not responsible often for the training. You're often not responsible for the transition. But the problem is, if you deliver that wonderful piece of equipment, if you're the external deliver whatever you've been asked to deliver, and then the organisation doesn't pick it up, you're an easy target for the blame. So one of the things to consider here is, are you a team manager of a bigger project, in which case, who's doing the change, who's the project manager, who's the program manager? Have you raised risks? Have you raised concerns about the dependencies on other those sorts of things? So, so that I understand that I'm not responsible for the training, but can you confirm who's picking up? I need to talk to them or provide them information. So it's almost, what are the dependency links? Have those been identified? And if you're raising those as risks as part of your input to your client, then your client should be being prompted to think about those sorts of areas. Have they resolved those sorts of dependency risks? Have they considered the true scope of the change? It's always the similar questions I was dealing with this week when I was looking at an internal IT department for being asked to do changes across quite a large organisation. But they only do the technical bit, and it's who's doing the transition bit, who's doing the people bit. And they're asking the same kind of questions as an external vendor. It's you maybe being there for the technical bit, ask who's doing the transition bit, raise those sorts of dependencies. If the organisation hasn't thought about that at all, then it may well be that if you have those sort of skills, it's something else you could actually get involved in if it's appropriate. If it's not, then it's for the client to think about those sorts of things. But raises the risk of what would happen if, and therefore you can show that you can do the best you can about delivering your solution, but it's about how do I raise their awareness of the other bits and pieces. So it's a kind of thought depends as a risk is a good way forward. That would appear to be all of the questions we've had so far. Thank you for your questions. They've been very interesting, very useful. There is another session at 2 p.m. For those of you, if you have colleagues who've missed this one that might find this useful or interesting, and therefore you can log at that particular point. So if there are no final questions, thank you very much for your input. Thank you for listening. There will be an email coming out on Monday about this, and you will find that the audio of this will be available on YouTube at some point in the very near future. Thank you again for listening.